Nicaragua is unfortunately in the news again. I've spoken to you before about the head of the state there, Daniel Ortega, who is no friend of the church, no friend of Catholicism, and has rather been open about his disdain for all things Catholic. If there is any problem with the signal today, here in Oklahoma, we're having storms today. So again, prayers for people in my state. Probably everybody will be okay, but still some prayers for general safety and everything else. But if there's any signal problems, that's what you're seeing. It's just storms and nothing I can do about it. But we're going to forge ahead. But I've reported on what's going on in Nicaragua recently with Ortega and his men. At least 3 bishops have been expelled from Nicaragua by the secular authorities because they dare to do things like talk about things you're supposed to talk about as Catholic priests, as bishops. And the consequence for that is that sometimes church leadership has to speak against what government officials do. That kind of comes with the territory. They're not supposed to be captured by grant dollars given to them by the government for their loyalty. Instead, the church should speak against evil things done by secular authorities. And unfortunately, in Nicaragua, once Catholic country, still dominated by Catholics when you look at the numbers, but the rulers of that country are no longer Catholic. In that country, the state is trying to destroy the church. It's no other way to describe it. In fact, recently they've been getting bolder in how far they're willing to go, because now they're expelling the actual most senior bishop in the entire country has been kicked out of the country. So we'll go to America Magazine for this headline. Nicaragua regime expels country's top Catholic bishop. The country's top Catholic bishop. Imagine if, say, thought experiment here, let's say the loser in the recent American election had won instead of actually losing and decided to openly try to crush and control the church in America. Imagine in this scenario that Cardinal Cupich was kicked out of the country. He had to go to Canada, the UK, the Vatican, who knows where. That would be the equivalent if this happened in the United States. And I know it sounds ridiculous because there's no circumstance in which Cardinal Cupich would not be buddy-buddy with the loser of the of the most recent contest. But if that scenario had played out like that, that is what the equivalent would be, because Cardinal Cupich is, for all intents and purposes, the top bishop in the United States. He is the voice of Francis on all things. The bishops listen to him when he speaks, even if they don't want to, because he has that kind of authority and that kind of seniority in the church in America. It's why his recent talk of the U.S. bishops need to start implementing synodality turned into, at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops meeting this past week in Baltimore, the implementation, they're agreeing to create a task force for the implementation of synodality in the church in America. Yeah, your diocese and Novus parishes are going to change in the next few years, probably not for the better. But here is this is what has turned the most recent turning of events in Nicaragua. This article is very short, so we'll go over the whole thing. The ruling Sandinista regime expelled the president of the Nicaraguan Bishops' Conference, further decimating the country's Catholic leadership as clergy are forced into exile. Bishop Carlos Enrique Herrera of Ortega was forced to leave Nicaragua after accusing a local Sandinista mayor of sacrilege for disturbing a celebration of the Mass by blaring loud music outside the cathedral, according to Nicaraguan media. So in other words, the bishop, knowing what he was taking a big risk, got punished for defending the integrity of the Mass as it was being offered when the locals were clearly trying to disrupt the Mass. He did his job in a pretty mild way, and now he's paying the price for it. The bishop was to board a November 12th flight from the country's capital to Guatemala City, independent news outlet Confidencial reported. His whereabouts are unknown, though Confidencial reported he was received by the Order of Friars Minor, which he belongs to. Herrera said during the November 10th Mass, "We ask the Lord's forgiveness for our faults and also for those who do not respect worship and truth, as this is a sacrilege that the mayor and the municipal authorities are committing. Go tell them because they know the time of the Mass." The Mass was broadcast on the diocesan Facebook page, but the page was subsequently inaccessible. Local governments throughout Nicaragua routinely surveil priests during Mass and stage noisy events nearby, such as boxing matches outside the cathedral in Leon earlier this year. Herrera, who has been the president of Nicaragua's Bishops' Conference since 2021, became the third bishop expelled from Nicaragua in 2024. Bishop Rolando Alvarez of Matagalpa, who was serving a 26-year prison sentence, and Bishop Isidoro Moro of Ciuna, who was detained in December of last year after expressing support for Bishop Alvarez, were sent to the Vatican in January after Nicaragua and the Vatican reached an agreement for the release of 19 churchmen. The expulsion of clergy has left 4 dioceses without bishops. Just 22 priests remain in the Diocese of Matagalpa, which had 70 priests prior to the regime's attacks on the church and Alvarez, according to Martha Patricia Molina, a Nicaraguan lawyer in exile who tracks church persecution in the Central American country. The regime of President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, have targeted the Catholic Church as they concentrate power and stamp out any space for dissenting voices. There's no way that's not on purpose, right? They're clearly trying to make it as uncomfortable as possible for people to even attend mass when their bishops otherwise, or their priests otherwise do as the secular authorities demand of them. Hence, all the sporting events and concerts and things they hold at the same time down the road from the mass to make it as loud as possible. I mean, that's diabolical, but it's also meant to entice people to go to those events instead of going to the mass, to make people consciously choose to skip going to mass for some worldly entertainment instead. Multiple layers of this diabolical evil going on in that country. The silence on this issue from Rome is deafening. Well, mostly silence. See, Pope Francis rarely shies away from political subjects, and yet he hasn't said much about what's going on in Nicaragua, if anything. For example, his Angelus addresses are often places he puts in not terribly subtle references to things going on in the world that concern him. And his comments are often fodder for news commentators. Yesterday's Angelus address was, well, severely lacking. Instead, returning to a favorite subject of his. So we go to the National Catholic Register, that's the print arm of EWTN. This headline: Pope Francis, the poor continue to wait for the church, governments to take action. During his homily and Angelus address, the Holy Father repeated his plea for Catholics to show their closeness to the poor through gestures of care infused with warmth and tenderness. Nothing wrong with the man the world accepts as Pope to calling people to help the poor. Jesus told us to help the poor. He also, though, told us that we will always have the poor with us. So sometimes Francis's message about poverty crossed the line into fantasy. And where is that line? When he starts talking about eliminating poverty, it's like secular authorities tend to talk about how we're going to eliminate poverty. You can't eliminate poverty. It is impossible to do so. Why is it impossible to do so? Well, if you want a secular explanation, you start talking about how it's what would in policy circles, the stuff I trained for years ago, they would call it a wicked problem, which is a policy problem that has so many different facets to it, so many different variables that go into it, that it's nearly impossible to solve. If you want a theological answer, it's because Jesus told us that we will always have the poor with us. When God tells you something, gives you a definitive answer to a question like that, it might be worth taking him seriously on. That does not mean we should not go out and try to make the situation for the poor better and to try to drive down poverty as low as we can get it and all the rest of it. That's fine. Stuff we can debate on how and what we should be doing. But it's a little weird when Francis gives his Angelus address at a time when a bishop is expelled from a country that is currently actively trying to lead people out of the church and to crush the church. The rulers like that in Nicaragua and anywhere else you find them, their main objection to religion is typically that the state needs to be absolutely supreme, without question, supreme. They want the state to be God. The state is not God, can never be treated as such, and they demand the church surrender to the state. The Catholic Church has historically always refused to do this, and the Catholic Church has never had a problem working with some really bad figures in history. As long as those really bad figures allowed the church to do the work of the church in the country, they could get along with some really unsavory figures. You have to be an especially bad dictator for the Catholic Church not to be able to operate in your country. And that's what they're going for here in Nicaragua. In fact, this kind of weird silence about what's going on in Nicaragua from Rome is so weird because, let me put it this way. if I'm a leader in the church, if I have a leadership position in the church, it gets to be kind of bad when the German bishops are saying the right thing much more than Rome is. You're familiar with this man. It's Bishop Georg Botzing, who really wants to be a Protestant minister. If you ever listen to the things he wants to do to the church in Germany, and he doesn't hide it. I mean, again, that's a bishop. Look how he's dressed. Doesn't look. He looks like he's either on his way to go do a volunteer shift at the library, or to be a headmaster at a school somewhere, or to go preach a sermon on sola scriptura at a Lutheran church building somewhere. Here's the headline from katholisch.de, the official news arm of the heretical German bishops. Bishop Botzing calls for commitment to human rights in Nicaragua. So, for the record, Botzing, one of the worst bishops in the church today, is taking a greater leadership position on this than Francis seems to be. I know, that's a weird place to be, to even have to tell you this, but that's where we are. Botzing, who never saw a heresy or a sin of the flesh he didn't think the church should take seriously, in the name of synodality, wants the church to do something about the situation in Nicaragua. And you know what they say about broken clocks and all the rest, and we have a case of that here. Let's go take a look at what he has to say from the article. Quote, the chairman of the German Bishops' Conference is calling on the federal government of Germany to do more to protect human rights in Nicaragua. Authoritarianism and arbitrary government rule in the Central American country and human dignity is being trampled on, criticized Bishop Georg Botzing on Sunday. He made the statement following the forced expulsion of his Nicaraguan counterpart, Carlos Enrique Herrera. This step by President Daniel Ortega's regime is further evidence of the increasing systematic repression of the Catholic Church and the opposition. I appeal to the German federal government and the international community to stand up more strongly for the rights of all people in Nicaragua, said the Limburg bishop. Herrera's forced expulsion became known a few days ago. The Bishop of Ortega is also the chairman of the Nicaraguan Bishops' Conference. He is said to have been expelled from the country and flown to Guatemala after a sermon critical of the government. Herrera's expulsion brings the number of bishops forced out of the country this year to 3. The Ortega regime has previously expelled Bishop Rolando Alvarez of Matagalpa for a long prison sentence and Bishop Isidoro Mora of Siona, who are considered government critics. The auxiliary bishop of Managua, Silvio Baez, had also previously left the country. He was sent abroad by Pope Francis in 2019 after there were allegedly several threats against his person against Baez. Since then, he has lived in exile in the U.S. Hammer and sickle regime in Managua has been cracking down on church representatives and their institutions for years. In addition, thousands of non-governmental organizations have been deprived of their legal basis. The crisis in Nicaragua has been ongoing since 2018. At that time, hundreds of people have expired as a result of police violence during anti-government protests. You get the idea. Katholisch, the German bishops, the synodal way German bishops who threatened to go into schism if they didn't get priestesses, are taking a better stand against this evil than Rome is. It's utterly remarkable. Utterly. Now, the closest to commentary on this we get from Rome comes to us from almost 2 months ago now, which is Catholic News Agency. So the Cardinal Secretary of State is the chief diplomat of the Vatican, also sometimes called the Vice Pope. And this one is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who, by the way, his name is increasingly being talked about as the potential next pope. He would be a Bergoglian through and through. The Sino deal, the deal made with Cardinal Zen's home country, that evil government. Yeah, that's him. That's Cardinal Parolin. Here's what he had to say. Headline from Catholic News Agency. Cardinal Parolin decries wars, the Moloch ritual, the ideology of the flesh, and repression in UN address. Yeah, and he actually had a lot to say on a lot of topics there. But the closest we got to commentary on what's going on there came from Rome, came back in October 1st. Again, almost 2 months ago. And his remarks were not terribly long. So from the article, quote, the Vatican official expressed concern about the attacks carried out by the dictatorship of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, against the, quote, personnel and institutions of the church, which directly affect the delicate issue of religious freedom, stressing that it must always be guaranteed. Parolin indicated the Holy See is open to a respectful dialogue with the authorities of the Central American country to resolve the difficulties and promote peace, fraternity, and harmony for the benefit of all. He emphasized that the Venezuelan people, despite the numerous challenges they face, continue to trust in democratic values enshrined in the Constitution. And then it goes on because Venezuela's got its own problems, so he sort of lumped it all together. He's willing to work with Nicaragua's government to try to come to a solution where the church can operate there. Maybe the point that they need to understand is the goal of Ortega is to make it so the church cannot operate anymore in that country. After all, they're scheduling rock concerts and boxing matches and who knows what else outside of parishes, loud, noisy events during Mass to try to get people to not only disrupt the Mass going on there, which is evil and supremely evil, but also to entice people to go to those things instead. That is, they're using right now the carrot and stick approach to getting people to stop going to Mass. And right now they're leaning on the carrot. But once in a while they bring out the stick to expel bishops and things. How much longer until they get more overt? This is one of those things that I wish more people were talking about going on in South America. Let's take a look here at the live chat. Margaret says, Jesus said the poor will inherit the kingdom. He has a special love for the poor. Yes. Bear in mind also, though, it's also the spiritually poor. A lot of priests in the church emphasize often that spiritual poverty is something more that we should be focusing on as a good, as a positive thing than necessarily just actual material poverty. After all, there are examples, plenty of examples of saintly, wealthy people throughout history who understood that they could get to heaven too, and that they were called because of the material wealth they had to do specific things for the church. Female Casey Rose fan says, you can decrease poverty by having intact families with a mother and a father. Yeah, that the modern world doesn't want to hear any of that stuff. Come on, family, come on. Satan is very noisy where Jesus brings peace. Yeah. Sammy says the state has no problem communicating the evils imagined or true of the church. The church has the power to speak truth to power. Generally, yes. It's really amazing you don't hear much about this from the American bishops. I guarantee you the stuff going on down there are one of the causes of the stuff that Texas has to deal with all the time. You know, people who really want to come here, that problem. Guarantee you the situation in Nicaragua is making that worse. What was Francis's record under the Argentine dictatorship? Not very good. Not very good. If you read the first edition of the biography by professional Francis fan fiction writer Austin Ivere on that subject, the first edition, future editions pare down that section of the book dramatically. But the first edition makes it pretty clear that Francis was then Father Bergoglio and then eventually Bishop and then Archbishop and Cardinal Bergoglio was complicit with what was going on. That's probably why he's never been back to Argentina and will probably never go back. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. If you have any thought, those watching later, if you have any thoughts, please let me know in the comments. Please pray for what's going on in that country. The people of that country definitely, and the church in the country needs your help. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.